You know, usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there is this expectation of absolute clinical precision.
Right. Yeah, you expect it to be very cut and dry.
Yeah, think about orthopedics, for instance. You take a bad fall, your arm swells up, and you go to the hospital.
And they take an x-ray.
Right. The doctor takes an x-ray, pulls up that black and white image on the screen, points to a very clear, jagged white line running through the bone, and says, well, there is the fracture.
It is binary. I mean, the bone is broken or it is intact.
Yeah.
It is clean, it is visual, and frankly, it is highly comforting to the human mind. We really like things to be visible.
We want to categorize the problem neatly.
Precisely. We categorize it so we can prescribe a straightforward mechanical solution.
Yeah.
Put a cast on it, wait 6 weeks, and the problem is resolved.
But then you step into the world of theology, specifically the spiritual diagnosis of the human heart.
Oh, and that is a completely different landscape.
It is. Suddenly, that clinical x-ray machine is just completely shattered. We are looking at a diagnostic landscape that is incredibly murky and full of contradictions.
Right, because we look at human behavior out in the world, and what do we actually see?
We see incredible, selfless philanthropy sitting right next to unimaginable cruelty.
Yeah, we see unparalleled technological brilliance occurring at the same time as total moral collapse.
So trying to figure out the root cause of the human condition based purely on observation, well, it feels like an impossible task.
It really does. We see the symptoms, but diagnosing the actual disease feels entirely out of reach.
It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters from our limited, finite human perspective.
And we constantly misdiagnose the underlying disease.
Why do you think that is?
Well, the reason we misdiagnose it is that our own vision is compromised by the very condition we are trying to observe.
I see.
I mean, a sick eye cannot accurately diagnose a sick body. We need an external objective diagnostic tool to tell us what actually happens inside the human chest.
Welcome to Reformed Thinking. Today, we are looking at a text that proves the spiritual x-ray machine is broken and offers the only accurate diagnostic tool available.
And we are really excited to get into this material today.
We are taking a deep dive into an incredible set of texts from the 19th century. Specifically, we are examining excerpts from Charles Simeon's Horae Homileticae, Volume 15.
We are focusing intensely on his sermons covering the first chapter of the book of Romans.
Our mission here is to extract the core theological arguments regarding the Apostle Paul's pastoral heart, his unashamed confession of the gospel, and the inexcusable guilt of all mankind.
And also what might be the most shocking claim of all, the inherent enmity of the human mind toward God.
For you listening, we know you want a thorough theological understanding without feeling buried under an avalanche of dry academic terminology.
Right. We're going to break down these massive, weighty doctrines into clear, memorable pieces.
We want to connect this historical exposition directly to your everyday faith.
And we are looking at this through the lens of Reformed theology, adhering to the Westminster Confession, to see how these truths apply to the modern world.
The Book of Romans is arguably the most systematic theological document in existence.
Yeah, and Simeon's treatment of it brings out a stunning level of practical application that cuts right to the bone of our daily lives.
Setting the stage for this, we really have to look at the source text itself and understand why we are focusing on an epistle rather than a gospel.
That is a critical distinction to make right at the start.
The Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they give us the historical reality of the life, death, and resurrection of Christ.
But Simeon makes a striking point right out of the gate here.
He argues that the epistles, and Romans in particular, offer an unparalleled, systematic look at justification by faith alone.
Think about it. If you only had the historical accounts of Christ's life, you would have the flawless, sinless record of the Son of God.
Which is glorious, obviously.
Right, but you might lack the detailed, structured, forensic explanation of how his righteousness is actually imputed to flawed, rebellious people like us.
And that distinction completely changes how we read the New Testament.
Simeon actually addresses a thought that sometimes floats around certain intellectual circles.
Yeah, I have heard this one before.
It is the idea that it would have been better if only the historical accounts of Jesus had survived and the letters of Paul had perished.
People who say that usually just want a religion of moral imitation, right?
Yeah, they do. Simeon calls that sentiment impious. He argues it originates in a hidden hatred of the truth.
Wow. He does not hold back.
Not at all. The historical accounts contain the truths of salvation, but the letters of Paul render them with forensic clarity.
The epistles show us how the early church wrestled with the application of justification.
They explain the actual mechanism of grace.
Without Romans, we would lack the definitive, incontrovertible establishment of justification by faith alone.
Which, as we know from the Westminster Confession, is the very bedrock of the Protestant Reformation.
Let us start where Simeon starts in his exposition, looking at Romans chapter 1, verses 8 through 12.
Before getting to the heavy theological doctrines of Romans, we have to look at the man writing the letter.
We have to look at his posture toward the recipients. We need to look at Paul's heart.
He treats the Roman church with a paternal, almost maternal affection.
He writes that he is praying for them incessantly, which is fascinating because he had never seen them in person.
It is a really remarkable relational dynamic. Paul is writing to the capital of the known world, to a congregation he did not plant.
To people whose faces he has never seen.
Yet he writes that God is his witness, that without ceasing he makes mention of them always in his prayers.
Simeon points out that as a title of honor, a minister might act as an ambassador from the Creator.
But the paternal relation is the most endearing.
Paul compares himself elsewhere to a nursing mother caring for her children.
This is not a detached academic sending a dry theological treatise to a university.
Right, this is a pastor agonizing in prayer for a flock he has not yet met.
He is carrying their spiritual weight on his shoulders.
Simeon breaks down a minister's joy over his people into 3 distinct groups. And this categorization is just brilliant.
It really is helpful for understanding pastoral ministry.
The first group consists of those who are just beginning to show concern for their souls.
Simeon describes them as having previously lived without God in the world.
They were completely absorbed in secular pursuits, entirely indifferent to eternity.
Right up until God opened their eyes to their guilt and their danger.
Notice the specific reformed framework Simeon uses to describe that first group.
He says the change proceeded from God alone.
It was God who first opened their hearts to attend to the things spoken, quickening them from the dead.
And that perfectly mirrors the Westminster Confession's teaching on effectual calling.
To understand the mechanics of this, you have to recognize that a person does not simply decide one day to care about eternity.
No, it's not out of their own innate wisdom or superior intellect.
The natural will is completely hostile. God must sovereignly implant new dispositions.
Simeon rejoices over this first group because he sees the initial spark of regeneration.
Even if their theological knowledge is tiny, right?
Yeah, even if their attainments are small, he rejoices because a supernatural resurrection has occurred in their chest.
I like to think of it as the difference between giving a blind man a flashlight and actually giving him the capacity to see.
That is a great analogy. The flashlight is totally useless until the eyes are opened.
Now, the second group Simeon mentions are those making progress in the divine life.
Here is where his pastoral insight becomes highly practical.
He contrasts them with people who fall away, drawing heavily from the parable of the sower.
He details 3 specific dangers that threaten progressing believers.
The fear of man, the cares of this life, and the lusts of the flesh.
We really need to analyze why those 3 specific dangers drag people down.
Let us start with the fear of man. That is a massive stumbling block.
Especially in the first century Roman context, but equally so today.
Simeon notes how many thousands turn aside because they cannot bear the social cost of adhering to Christ.
Then you have the cares of this life.
Yeah.
Career ambitions, financial worries.
The desire to maintain a certain lifestyle.
These cares act like gravity, constantly dragging the mind down to this perishing world and choking out spiritual fruit.
Finally, there are the lusts of the flesh, the internal corruptions that people refuse to mortify.
For a minister to see believers successfully bypass those massive hazards and actually make progress well, it produces an exalted joy.
It proves that the Creator is holding them up in his everlasting arms,
preserving them through a very hostile environment.
The third group consists of those walking worthy of their high calling.
These are the believers whose faith is spoken of throughout the whole world.
Which was literally true of the Roman congregation at that time.
Simeon says we thank God for them because they bring glory to their Creator.
They do good for mankind, and they are ripening for the blessings of a better world.
He asserts a fascinating point here. He says, without these zealous believers, works of humanity might go on, but works of religion would stagnate altogether.
That observation requires some careful thought.
It does. General civic goodness like building hospitals, funding orphanages, or feeding the hungry can be motivated by general human empathy.
Or even just a desire for a legacy.
Right. but the specific work of advancing the gospel, of laboring intensely for the spiritual salvation of fellow humans.
That requires a zeal that only comes from a regenerated heart.
A secular society can build a well-functioning city, but it will never build a mechanism for spiritual rescue.
Simeon looks at the Roman Christians and sees a people who are functioning as brilliant lights in a thoroughly dark empire.
Sustaining the only mission that has eternal consequences.
I want to push back on something Simeon argues here, though, or at least raise a question about the necessity of the epistles regarding human piety.
Okay, what is your thought?
Simeon argues that the letters of Paul show us heights of piety attainable by fallen humans that we would not see in the historical accounts of Christ alone.
He does say that.
But why is that distinction necessary? If the historical accounts give us Christ's flawless example, should that not be enough of a template for human piety?
You mean we see perfection? So we should just aim for it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it seems straightforward.
You might assume the perfect example would be enough. But here is the critical difference between unattainable perfection and flawed, redeemed nature.
Okay, lay it out for me.
Christ was sinless. He did not have a carnal, rebellious nature to war against. His obedience was the flawless submission of the God-man.
Right, he had no internal corruption.
When we read his life, we see the absolute standard of divine holiness. But if we only had that perfect standard, we would inevitably fall into total despair.
Because we could never match it.
We would look at our own hearts, see the indwelling sin, and say, well, I have a corrupt nature. I cannot possibly live like that. The gap is just too wide.
Ah, so the letters give us the gritty reality of sanctification in the trenches.
Precisely. The epistles show us applied theology. They show us how justification by faith actually plays out in the lives of men and women with passions and flaws identical to ours.
We see Paul agonizing over his own internal struggles in Romans 7.
Describing the war between his mind and his flesh.
We see him correcting church factions, dealing with false teachers.
And displaying this intense protective love for his congregations.
The epistles show us what it looks like for a desperately flawed human being to be progressively sanctified by the Spirit.
They give us a realistic, attainable model of Christian maturity while constantly pointing back to Christ as the sole source of imputed righteousness.
Let us take a moment to extrapolate this into our modern context. What would modern local churches look like if this level of incessant, unseen prayer and mutual comfort became the standard?
It is hard to even imagine, honestly.
So often we treat church as a weekly event. We show up, sing a few songs, listen to a sermon, and go home to our private lives.
But Paul's desire to visit Rome was not for religious tourism.
He did not want to go to the capital of the world to see the Colosseum.
Or to gain popularity in the imperial court. He explicitly states he wanted to impart spiritual gifts and enjoy the mutual comfort of shared faith.
If modern congregations adopted this posture, it would radically alter the landscape of Christian community.
Intercessory prayer would cease being a mere formality.
It would become the actual engine of the church.
Furthermore, the relationship between pastors and congregants would shift entirely from a service provider model to a family model.
Paul explicitly states he wants to be comforted together with them by their mutual faith.
There is such an incredible humility in that statement.
The great apostle, the man who wrote half the New Testament, needs the comfort of the Roman believers just as much as they need his instruction.
It completely destroys the modern hierarchy of professional clergy versus passive laity.
But this tight-knit community accountability you are describing, well, they are going to need that immediately.
Oh, without a doubt.
Because Paul is not just sending a polite greeting to a group of friends. He is sending a message that will make them social outcasts in Roman society.
And that leads directly into Romans chapter 1, verse 16.
Where Paul makes his famous declaration, "I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ."
We have to understand the intense cultural friction happening here. Paul is stepping into an arena of massive intellectual and cultural pride.
Rome was the seat of empire, the apex of architecture, law, and military might.
They viewed themselves as the absolute pinnacle of human achievement.
And the gospel, on the other hand, was a message of absolute disgrace to the Roman mind.
It centered entirely on a Jewish carpenter who was executed via crucifixion.
Crucifixion was a punishment reserved exclusively for the lowest slaves and the worst rebels.
It was considered so shameful that polite Roman society deemed it inappropriate to even mention the word in casual conversation.
And yet, Paul is saying he is not ashamed of this message.
Simeon points out that while few people today might verbally admit to being ashamed of the gospel, multitudes actually are.
He outlines 3 specific ways people demonstrate this shame in their actions.
The first way is by avoiding instruction.
He uses the historical example of Nicodemus, the religious leader who came to Jesus by night under the cover of darkness.
People might have a secret conviction that the gospel is true, but they avoid evangelical churches or religious instruction because they fear the stigma attached to it.
They do not want their friends or intellectual colleagues to think they are embracing obnoxious, outdated tenets.
The psychology of intellectual pride plays a massive role there.
The second way Simeon mentions is avoiding open profession.
People want the crown without the cross.
They might mentally agree with the truth of salvation, but they refuse to publicly align themselves with a group that is socially mocked.
The third way is not walking worthy of the message.
This involves making worldly compliances to screen themselves from criticism,
They intentionally lower their moral standards to blend in with their secular environment.
hiding their light under a bushel to avoid the friction that holiness inevitably causes in a corrupt culture.
Let me paint a picture based on Simeon's text to bring this into the present day.
Please do.
Imagine someone sitting at their desk in a modern corporate office, reading their Bible during a lunch break.
Okay, I can picture that.
Suddenly, a highly secular, perhaps aggressively anti-religious executive colleague knocks on the door.
The immediate, almost reflex-like instinct for many believers would be to quickly shove the Bible off the desk into a drawer.
Or throw a manila folder over it. Why do we do that? What is the mechanism driving that change?
From a Reformed perspective, is it just the fear of a socially awkward conversation, or is something much deeper happening?
It is so much deeper than social awkwardness. The friction occurs because the gospel inherently insults human achievement.
Which is the currency of the corporate world, the academic world, and polite society.
The Reformed doctrine of total depravity tells the wealthy CEO and the destitute beggar that they are equally bankrupt before a holy God.
Equally incapable of saving themselves, and equally in need of divine charity.
The natural ego hates that leveling of the playing field.
It strips away every resume and every bank account.
It absolutely strips them away. So when a person shoves the Bible in a drawer out of a sudden spike of anxiety about their reputation, they are making a theological statement.
They are declaring, functionally, that the approval of mortals is superior to the majestic plan of the Trinity.
Simeon notes that if you make sacrifices to avoid instruction or profession, you are deciding that your temporary social comfort is more valuable than eternal truth.
You are choosing the praise of men over the praise of your Creator.
Which makes Simeon's reasons for not being ashamed so compelling.
He gives 3 massive, weighty reasons why the gospel should be our absolute boast, regardless of the cultural temperature.
First, he says it is a revelation of grace orchestrated by the entire Trinity.
We are talking about the covenant of redemption here.
The Father elects a people and sends the Son.
The Son takes on human nature and acts to secure reconciliation by his blood.
And the Holy Spirit actively applies that salvation to the individual, making them fit for the inheritance.
When you view salvation as the coordinated, eternal action of the triune God, the idea of being ashamed of it becomes utterly absurd.
Simeon asks a piercing question. Is that in which all the wisdom and might of God are concentrated an object we should blush to acknowledge?
This plan is the one theme of adoration for all the hosts of heaven.
For a tiny, finite human on earth to veil it simply for fear of a colleague's reproach is extreme folly.
His second reason is that it is God's singular instrument for salvation throughout all of human history.
It saved Adam when the promise was given that the seed of the woman would crush the serpent's head.
It saved Abraham, who believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness.
It is the only mechanism that has ever successfully saved a human soul.
And this leads to an incredible, vivid illustration Simeon uses regarding the brazen serpent in the wilderness.
That illustration from the book of Numbers is brilliant for explaining human psychology.
Set the scene for us there.
The Israelites were dying from venomous snake bites as a judgment for their rebellion. God commanded Moses to make a serpent of brass and put it on a pole.
And the promise was simple. Anyone who looked at the brass serpent would live.
It was a completely irrational cure to the human mind, looking at a piece of metal to cure deadly venom. But it worked because God ordained it.
Later in Israel's history, as recorded in 2 Kings, the people actually started worshiping that piece of brass.
Burning incense to it, turning the instrument of their physical healing into a permanent idol.
They named it Nehushtan and treated it like a deity.
Yes, they did. Simeon uses this history to make a devastating point about our modern embarrassment.
He says if the ancient Israelites ended up venerating a mere piece of brass simply because it was a temporary instrument of physical healing.
How shocking is it when modern people treat the eternal gospel, the instrument of everlasting spiritual salvation, with embarrassment and contempt?
That comparison hits hard. We look at the Israelites and think they were foolish for worshiping a brass snake.
Yet we will hide the message that cures eternal death because we are worried about losing a promotion.
Simeon's third reason not to be ashamed is simply that the gospel actually works.
It is entirely effective. It leaves no believer under guilt or pollution.
The forensic justification it provides gives the believer a pure and perfect standing before the bench of divine justice.
But this raises a massive question. Why do we need this cure?
Why is humanity in such a desperate state?
That brings us to Paul's argument in Romans 1, verses 20 through 21, where he establishes the universal, inexcusable guilt of mankind.
Paul builds his legal case systematically, like a prosecutor laying out evidence.
Before he can offer the cure of the gospel, he has to prove the diagnosis is terminal for every single person.
He starts with the Gentile world, the pagan nations who did not have the written law of Moses or the covenants of Israel.
Simeon points out that while they did not have the written book of divine revelation, they possessed the book of creation.
The book of creation. Let us unpack that concept. We are talking about natural revelation here.
By observing the heavenly bodies moving in precise orbits, the earth providing seasonal food and resources,
And the staggering intricacy of the human body.
the Gentile world should have deduced the existence of an eternal, self-existent creator.
Simeon argues this using a teleological framework.
He says a person cannot look upon any work of art, a well-constructed house, or a complex watch with all its gears and mainsprings, without knowing instantly that there was a maker.
The human mind is necessarily led to contemplate the builder when viewing the building.
Therefore, looking at the immensity and excellency of the universe, the ancient world should have recognized a first cause whose wisdom and might are infinite.
The invisible attributes of the Creator are clearly seen in the visible world.
But instead of glorifying him as God, instead of offering gratitude, what did humanity do?
They suppressed the truth. They made idols.
They traded the glory of the incorruptible God for images resembling mortal men, birds, four-footed animals, and creeping things.
They showed zero gratitude for the constant succession of blessings they received, the rain, the harvest, the breath in their lungs.
And as a direct result of that idolatry, they plunged into horrifying moral degradation.
Simeon references Paul quoting the Cretan poet. The Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, slow bellies.
It was a wretched compound of falsehood, cruelty, and sensuality.
And lest we look at the ancient Gentiles with a smug sense of chronological snobbery, Simeon brings the application directly to the modern era.
We have infinitely superior advantages compared to the ancient world.
We have the completed written revelation of Scripture. We have the historical reality of the Incarnation.
Yet, without the intervening grace of God holding us back, we act precisely the same.
We commit socially acceptable sins: envy, deceit, backbiting, corporate greed.
And we create a false, sanitized concept of God in our minds to justify our behavior.
I want to focus on that false concept of God. Simeon says we construct a God solely of mercy, a deity who never punishes.
We want a grandfather in the sky who hands out blessings, winks at our indiscretions, and never demands a strict accounting for our actions.
But Simeon makes a stark assertion. A God all mercy is a God unjust.
That phrase is a huge theological anchor.
Think about a human judge in a modern courtroom.
If a judge pardons every murderer, thief, and embezzler that comes before his bench simply because he wants the public to know him as a merciful guy,
we would not call him a good judge. We would call him entirely corrupt.
we would demand his removal from the bench because he is actively failing to uphold justice and protect the innocent.
He would be a menace to society. The victims would receive no justice.
Precisely. So when we imagine a deity who simply waves away human rebellion, cruelty, lying, and idolatry without requiring any legal satisfaction for those crimes,
We are imagining an unjust, corrupt judge.
we are exalting our personal preference for comfort over his attribute of absolute holiness.
We divest him of all the authority that belongs to him as the righteous governor of the universe.
This is why penal substitutionary atonement is not just a theological theory. It is a logical necessity if God is to remain just while justifying the sinner.
Let us stay on that watchmaker analogy for a minute, because I want to push back using our Reformed theological framework.
Okay, let us hear the pushback.
You see a watch. You know there is a watchmaker. The evidence is clear. But from a Reformed perspective, we believe in total depravity.
Yes, we do.
We believe that human minds, emotions, and wills are entirely broken and corrupted by the fall of Adam.
That is correct.
If our faculties are that corrupted, if we are born spiritually dead, how is it fair that God holds humanity totally responsible for failing to read the book of creation accurately?
I see where you were going.
If a person is born physically blind, you do not throw them in prison for failing to describe the sunset.
That is the classic historical objection to the doctrine of total depravity, and it requires careful, nuanced distinction.
Break it down for us.
The Reformed view of free agency, which Simeon outlines in the text, distinguishes heavily between physical constraint and moral corruption.
This is often referred to as the difference between natural inability and moral inability.
Humans act according to their desires. The will is like a scale. It tips toward whatever the mind desires most in that moment.
Humans are not forced to sin against their will by some external cosmic dictator pushing them around like chess pieces.
They choose to suppress the truth because they actively love the darkness.
So the blindness is not a lack of physical capacity. The blindness is willful refusal.
Accurately stated, it is a moral inability. They do not lack the brain cells or the logical capacity to comprehend a creator.
Their will is just entirely hostile to the truth.
Simeon states that they were perfectly free agents in all that they did.
They could not plead ignorance because the evidence of the created order was overwhelming.
And they could not plead necessity because they were under no external physical compulsion to fashion idols out of wood and stone.
They violated the law written on their own consciences.
Therefore, the light they resisted actually constitutes the heaviest aggravation of their guilt. They saw the light, hated it, and chose the shadows.
Which brings us to the climax of Paul's indictment in Romans chapter 1.
It is not just that humans are passively ignorant.
It is not just that we casually excuse our sins or prefer comfort over truth.
Simeon highlights Romans 1, verse 30, where Paul drops the most staggering, offensive accusation of all.
He calls the natural human heart haters of God.
It is a phrase that completely arrests you. Haters of God.
Simeon anticipates the immediate, visceral reaction of his audience.
He says, if you go around to all the people you can find in polite society and ask them, are you a hater of God?
They will spurn the idea immediately. They will consider it a gross insult to their character.
The moral, philanthropic part of mankind would be filled with indignation.
Even the most immoral person on the street might say, well, I do not obey him as I should, and I have my flaws, but I certainly do not hate him.
But Simeon, following Paul's logic, insists this is a universal, undeniable fact.
Every single unconverted person falls into the category of a hater of God.
And he offers proof for this massive claim.
He says the proof is found in our daily choices. We consistently prefer the lowest gratifications over his explicit commands.
Any vain, worthless thing, a moment of gossip, a small financial gain, a fleeting physical pleasure,
is sufficient to draw us entirely away from our allegiance to him.
And here is the psychological test Simeon proposes, which cuts right through our polite defenses.
He asks his listeners to imagine a hypothetical scenario.
Supposing we were told, from an undoubted absolute authority, that there was no God to control us, no God to inspect our secret ways, no God to call us to a final account.
And that we were at complete liberty to follow our own desires without any fear of an afterlife or judgment.
Would it not, on the whole, be an acceptable, joyful report to the natural man?
The natural mind would feel massive, overwhelming relief.
Let us use an analogy to explain this mechanism.
Imagine an employee who absolutely resents the company owner.
The owner is strict, demands perfection, and misses nothing.
The employee might smile to the boss's face, meticulously follow the dress code, and do just enough work to avoid getting fired.
They maintain a polite veneer.
But the second they hear the owner's car leave the parking lot for a month-long vacation, they throw a party in the break room.
The rules are gone. The strict oversight is gone.
If you polled people on the street, 99% would violently deny being a hater of God.
How does the gospel tear down this polite moral veneer and expose the party in the break room?
The gospel tears it down by exposing the psychology of our modern idolatry.
People do not hate the God they invented in their own minds.
They love the grandfatherly figure who lowers his standards for them,
who winks at their minor sins, and who exists purely to assist them in achieving their personal career and relationship goals.
a cosmic butler.
But when they are confronted with the actual God of the Bible, the one who is infinitely holy, who demands perfect justice.
Who sees every hidden thought in the dark and who cannot look upon sin without absolute abhorrence.
The natural heart recoils in disgust.
Simeon points out the causes of this hatred. He says there is an absolute contrariety between his holy nature and our fallen nature.
It is the violent friction between light and darkness.
We do not naturally seek conformity to his image. In fact, if we see genuine, uncompromising holiness in another person, the natural human reaction is often intense irritation, mockery, or outright hostility.
And the ultimate historical test case for this theory is the incarnation.
When perfect holiness literally took on flesh and walked the earth in the person of Jesus Christ, how did humanity react to him?
They did not elect him king. They did not throw a parade to celebrate his pure morality.
They tortured and crucified him.
Simeon notes that this was not just the action of an ignorant, uneducated mob. It was the kings, the religious priests, the educated elite, and the common people all joining together in a unified coalition.
The human heart, when confronted with the unvarnished physical presence of the Creator, responded with premeditated murder.
The cross is the absolute ultimate proof of total depravity.
That is a chilling reality to sit with, and it explains the Reformed understanding of human depravity so clearly.
We consciously dread his coming judgment, and we deeply resent his moral authority over our private lives.
Simeon even makes the point that hell is not just a torture chamber. Hell is simply the human heart left entirely to its own devices, completely stripped of God's restraining common grace.
In the eternal state, the enmity of the human heart is no longer held back by social norms, fear of prison, or the common grace of education.
It leads to eternal blasphemy, malice, and anguish, because the heart is finally free to express its absolute hatred for the Creator.
The individuals in that state do not suddenly humble themselves and ask for forgiveness.
They carry their hostile dispositions with them, manifesting the full malignity that was previously restrained during their earthly lives.
This entire diagnostic progression forces us to realize how massive our humiliation before God should be.
If we only look at specific overt sins like lying or stealing, we miss the underlying disease. We have to probe our hearts to the very bottom and realize what monsters we would become if God simply abandoned us to our own inclinations.
This entire progression through Romans chapter 1 is a systematic dismantling of human pride.
Paul starts by showing his deep, agonizing love for the church, ensuring they know his pastoral heart.
Then he declares his unashamed boldness for a scandalous, socially unacceptable gospel.
Then he systematically proves why that gospel is absolutely necessary by exposing the universal guilt of mankind.
Starting with the failure to read the book of creation, and ending with the terrifying reality that the natural mind actively hates the Creator.
It is a devastating sequence of arguments, but it is entirely necessary.
You cannot appreciate the magnitude of the cure until you understand the absolute fatality of the disease.
God does not just offer to be reconciled to a group of neutral people who made a few mistakes. He actively pursues hostile rebels.
The gospel follows us with invitations and entreaties to lay aside our weapons and our enmity.
And when a person actually receives that gospel through effectual calling, it slays the enmity. It brings the soul into peace with God, removing the indisposition to what is good.
And actually writing the law of God upon the heart so that obedience becomes a joy rather than a burden.
Which allows us to synthesize this entire lengthy discussion and leave you with a totally new thought.
Something that builds on everything Simeon has laid out regarding the depravity of man and the grace of God.
If the natural, unregenerate human heart inherently and universally hates the true, holy God of the Bible,
if it recoils at his strict justice and rebels against his absolute sovereignty,
then any flicker of genuine love for him in your heart changes the entire equation.
it changes everything. If you find within yourself any genuine gratitude toward God for his holiness,
any sincere desire for his glory to be magnified, or any real piercing grief over your sin simply because it offends him,
you must realize that those feelings did not originate in your natural intellect.
they are not the product of your own reasoning or your own moral superiority.
They are absolute, concrete proof that a supernatural miracle, the new birth, has already occurred within your chest.
A dead heart cannot beat with affection for a holy God.
Only a resurrected heart can do that. If you mourn your sin and love his holiness, the Spirit has already done the impossible work within you.
So, as we close this deep dive, we want to challenge you to evaluate your own view of the divine.
Look closely at the deity you envision when you close your eyes to pray.
Are you worshiping the holy, just, and sovereign God of the Scriptures, the one who demands absolute perfection and deals severely with sin?
Or have you constructed an idol of your own making in your mind? A sanitized, comfortable deity designed to make you feel good without requiring your submission.
The true God demands everything from you, but he also provides everything you need through the perfect imputed righteousness of Christ.
Thank you for joining us for this rigorous look into the truth.
We will see you next time on Reformed Thinking.